What happens when a calm, charming Hollywood star suddenly refuses to stay polite on live television? And the tension in the studio becomes so thick that even the hosts don't know what to say next. That's exactly what unfolded when Chris Evans walked onto the set of The View and came face to face with the famously outspoken Joy Behar. The cameras were rolling. The audience was smiling. But within minutes, the atmosphere would change completely. Before we dive into this unforgettable moment, make sure you subscribe to Stage View, hit that like button, and drop a comment below telling us where you're watching from. Because stories like this only get more intense as they unfold. The studio lights glowed bright that morning in New York. The set of The View looked exactly the way millions of viewers recognized it. Sleek desk, cheering crowd, cameras gliding smoothly across the stage. But behind the cheerful applause, there was already a quiet buzz in the air. Chris Evans had arrived. The crowd erupted as he stepped out from backstage, dressed casually but sharply, his signature confident smile flashing across the room. He waved politely to the audience as he took his seat at the table. Joy Behar leaned forward with a grin. "Well, look at this," she said, adjusting her glasses. "Captain America himself." The audience laughed warmly. Chris chuckled. "It's good to be here." For the first few minutes, everything felt light, comfortable, the kind of playful back-and-forth daytime television thrives on. Joy tapped the desk lightly. "So, Chris, I gotta ask, do people still expect you to walk around saving the world now that you've hung up the shield?" Chris smiled again, relaxed. "Only on Mondays," he joked. The audience laughed. But Joy wasn't finished. "You know," she continued, tilting her head, "a lot of actors from big franchises struggle after those roles. Once you're not Captain America anymore, what happens?" A few murmurs slipped through the audience. Chris's smile didn't disappear, but something about his posture shifted slightly. "Well," he said calmly, "I try to pick projects that challenge me." Joy nodded slowly. "But do people take you seriously outside the superhero thing?" The question hung in the air longer than expected. Chris blinked once. There was a subtle tension now, almost invisible unless you were watching closely. "Well," he replied carefully, "I hope they do." Another host chimed in lightly, trying to keep the mood upbeat. "You've done plenty of serious films." But Joy leaned forward again. "Sure," she said, "but sometimes Hollywood types get a little comfortable preaching politics while playing pretend heroes. You've been pretty vocal lately." The audience quieted slightly. Chris Evans had never hidden his opinions. Over the years, he had spoken openly about political issues, social topics, and civic responsibility. Normally, he handled questions like these with smooth diplomacy. But Joy kept going. "Do you ever worry," she continued, "that people just want actors to entertain them, not lecture them?" A few people in the audience shifted in their seats. Chris folded his hands on the table. His voice stayed calm, but there was a firmness underneath it now. "I think everyone has a voice," he said. Joy smiled thinly. "Sure," she replied, "but some people think celebrities live in a bubble." A quiet ripple passed through the studio. For a moment, Chris didn't respond. He looked out toward the audience, then back at Joy. The smile he had walked out with earlier was still there, but it had changed. It wasn't playful anymore. It was focused. "You know," Chris said slowly, "I hear that a lot." Joy raised an eyebrow. And I think it's a convenient way to dismiss people instead of listening to them." The room went silent. One of the other hosts glanced between them quickly. Joy leaned back in her chair. "Oh, really?" she said. Chris nodded. "Yeah, because if someone says something you disagree with, it's easier to say, 'Oh, they're just a celebrity,' than actually address the point." A few members of the audience clapped lightly. Joy's smile tightened. "So you think critics just don't want to hear you?" "I think some people don't want conversations," Chris replied calmly. "They want silence." The tension was no longer subtle now. You could feel it in the studio. Joy rested her chin on her hand. "But Chris," she said, her tone sharpening just a little, "don't you think there's a difference between activism and actors thinking they're experts?" Chris looked directly at her. And for the first time, his answer came without hesitation. "Absolutely," he said. Joy blinked. The audience leaned forward. "But that applies to everyone," Chris continued. "Not just actors." There was a quiet "oh" from somewhere in the crowd. Joy tilted her head. "What's that supposed to mean?" Chris's expression stayed calm, but his eyes were steady now. "It means," he said, "having a microphone doesn't automatically make anyone an expert." The room froze. For a split second, Even the production crew seemed to hold their breath. Joy Behar slowly leaned back in her chair. "Well," she said coolly, "this is our show." Chris nodded politely. "And you invited me." The audience erupted with surprised laughter and scattered applause. Joy gave a tight smile. "Oh, I see." Chris leaned forward slightly. "But if we're going to talk," he said, "let's actually talk." There it was. The moment everything changed. The playful interview had quietly turned into something else entirely. One of the other hosts tried to jump in. Okay, let's keep it friendly." But Joy wasn't letting go. "So you think we're not having a real conversation?" she asked. Chris shrugged lightly. "I think sometimes TV conversations are designed more for sound bites than understanding." The audience reacted again, louder this time. Joy's eyebrows rose. "That's a bold thing to say on television." Chris smiled. "Maybe." A beat passed. Then he added, "But sometimes bold is honest." The crowd applauded again, louder now. Backstage, producers exchanged quick glances. This wasn't the cheerful promotional interview they had planned. The atmosphere had completely shifted. And Joy Behar wasn't finished yet. She leaned forward slowly, her voice calm but edged with challenge. "Well, Chris," she said, "since we're being honest, let me ask you something directly." Chris nodded. "Sure." Joy locked eyes with him. "Do you think actors like you understand the everyday struggles of regular Americans?" The audience gasped softly. The question hit harder than anything before it. For a moment, Chris Evans didn't answer. Not because he didn't have a response, but because the weight of the room had changed. He looked around the studio, at the cameras, the audience, the hosts. And then he looked back at Joy. When he finally spoke, his voice was calm, but the words were sharper than anyone expected. And the response he was about to give would turn this interview into one of the most talked about moments in daytime television. And that is where things really began to explode. For a brief moment after the question left her mouth, the studio fell into an uneasy silence. "Do you think actors like you understand the everyday struggles of regular Americans?" Every camera in the studio was pointed directly at Chris Evans. He sat still at the table of the view, his hands loosely clasped together. The audience could feel the tension building like pressure in the air before a storm. Across from him, Joy Behar watched carefully, her expression calm, but clearly expecting a reaction. For a moment, Chris simply exhaled. Then he leaned forward slightly. "You know," he said slowly, "that's a really interesting question." His tone was calm, almost too calm. Joy tilted her head. "I try." A few people in the audience chuckled nervously. Chris glanced toward the crowd briefly before returning his gaze to the hosts. "I think the real question," he continued, "is why people assume we don't." The audience murmured. Joy crossed her arms. "Well," she replied, "because actors live in a pretty different world than most people." Chris nodded. "That's fair." The audience seemed surprised by the quick agreement. But Chris continued. "Actors absolutely live different lives in many ways. I'm not going to pretend otherwise." Joy leaned back slightly, watching him closely now. "But different doesn't mean disconnected," Chris added. The room stayed quiet. Chris's voice was steady, firm, but never raised. "I grew up in Massachusetts," he said. "My mom worked. My dad worked. We weren't Hollywood elites." Joy nodded slightly. "But now you are," she said. The words weren't aggressive, but they carried a certain sharpness. Chris smiled faintly. "Now I'm lucky," he corrected. Another murmur ran through the audience. "And I try to remember that every single day." One of the other hosts leaned in with curiosity. "So when people criticize celebrities for speaking out," she asked, "how do you take that?" Chris leaned back in his chair, thinking for a moment. "Well," he said slowly, "I understand why some people feel that way." Joy raised an eyebrow. "Really?" Chris nodded. "Sure. People are struggling. Rent is high. Healthcare is complicated. Life can feel overwhelming." A few audience members nodded. "But here's the thing," Chris continued. "Having success doesn't suddenly erase your ability to care about those problems." The room grew quiet again. Joy tapped her fingers lightly on the desk. "But caring and understanding are two different things." Chris met her gaze. "Absolutely." Joy leaned forward again. "So tell me," she said, "how exactly does a movie star understand what it's like for someone working two jobs just to survive?" The tension crept back into the room. Some audience members shifted uncomfortably. Chris didn't flinch. Instead, he rested his elbows lightly on the desk. "You're right," he said calmly. I'm not working two jobs to survive. Joy nodded slightly as if expecting that admission. But that doesn't mean I don't listen to people who are. The audience applauded softly. Joy didn't smile this time. Listening isn't the same as living it. Chris paused. For the first time, a flicker of frustration crossed his face, but it was controlled. Of course it's not, he said. But if we only allowed people to talk about issues they personally experience, we'd never solve anything. A ripple of reaction spread across the audience. Chris continued. Empathy exists for a reason. Joy leaned back again, studying him carefully. So you see yourself as empathetic? Chris chuckled quietly. I try to be human. The audience laughed softly. But Joy wasn't letting the moment lighten. Some people would say Hollywood actors talk about empathy while flying around in private jets. The studio reacted instantly, half laughter, half gasps. Chris's smile faded just slightly. He took a breath. Well, he said calmly, some people also assume a lot without knowing the details. Joy raised her eyebrows again. Oh, Chris nodded. Look, I'm not here pretending I've had the hardest life in America. The audience listened closely now. But I do think something strange has happened in our culture. Joy folded her hands. And what's that? Chris's voice lowered just a little. We've started treating caring about people like it's a crime. The words landed heavily. No one spoke. Even Joy looked momentarily surprised. Chris continued quietly. If someone uses their platform to talk about something they believe in, suddenly the conversation becomes about whether they're allowed to care. The audience applauded again, louder this time. Joy waited for the noise to settle. Then she asked another question. But don't you see why people get tired of celebrities telling them how to think? Chris looked directly at her. I don't tell people how to think. Joy smiled faintly. Some might disagree. Chris shrugged. That's their right. The calmness in his voice was almost disarming. But here's the difference, he added. I speak because I care. Joy leaned in slightly. And critics would say you speak because you have influence. Chris nodded again. That too. The tension in the studio had shifted again. It wasn't explosive anymore. It was something deeper. A philosophical tug-of-war unfolding live on national television. One of the hosts finally broke in. I think what people are curious about, she said, is whether Hollywood sometimes forgets the people watching. Chris turned toward her. That's a fair concern. Joy smirked slightly. But, Chris took a breath. But the idea that actors should stay quiet because they're actors, that's a dangerous line. Joy's eyes narrowed slightly. Dangerous? Chris nodded. Yeah. The audience leaned forward again. Because history shows that artists have always been part of big conversations. He gestured slightly with his hands. Writers, musicians, filmmakers, they've always reflected society and questioned it. Joy folded her arms again. So you see yourself as part of that tradition. Chris hesitated for just a moment. Then he answered honestly. I see myself as a citizen who happens to have a microphone. The audience applauded loudly again. Joy waited for the sound to fade. Then she leaned forward with one more question. A sharper one. All right, she said slowly. If you're just a citizen with a microphone. Chris looked at her. Then why do so many people feel like celebrities talk down to them? The room went silent again. Chris Evans blinked once. That question had weight. Real weight. He looked down at the desk for a moment. Then he looked back up. When he spoke this time, his answer was slower, more personal, and what he was about to say would shift the entire conversation in a way no one in the studio expected. The silence that followed the question felt heavier than anything that had happened so far. Then why do so many people feel like celebrities talk down to them? Every eye in the studio turned toward Chris Evans. The cameras zoomed in slightly, capturing the moment from every angle on the set of The View. Across the table, Joy Behar waited patiently, her fingers folded together as if she had just placed the final chess piece on the board. For a few seconds, Chris didn't answer. Not because he didn't have something to say, but because he seemed to be choosing his words carefully. The audience could feel it. This wasn't just an interview anymore. This was a real conversation now, one that had slowly evolved into something deeper and more unpredictable. Chris leaned back slightly in his chair and took a quiet breath. He finally said, I think that feeling exists for a reason. A small ripple moved through the crowd. Joy raised an eyebrow. So you admit it? Chris nodded calmly. I think sometimes celebrities absolutely do talk down to people. The audience reacted instantly, murmurs, whispers, scattered applause. Joy looked almost pleased. Well, that's refreshingly honest. Chris gave a small shrug. Honesty is easier. The tension softened for a brief moment, but only briefly. Because Chris continued. But I also think something else is happening at the same time. Joy tilted her head slightly. And what's that? Chris leaned forward again, resting his hands on the table. We've created a culture where disagreement immediately turns into hostility. The room grew quiet again. Chris's voice remained steady. If someone says something you don't like, the first reaction isn't curiosity anymore. He paused. It's dismissal. Joy watched him closely. You mean like dismissing someone as just a celebrity? Chris nodded. Exactly. The audience murmured again. One of the hosts shifted in her chair. So you think the problem goes both ways? Chris smiled slightly. Almost every problem goes both ways. The crowd laughed softly. But Joy wasn't smiling now. So what you're saying, she replied slowly, is that people should be more open to what celebrities say. Chris shook his head gently. No. Joy blinked. No. Chris leaned forward again. I'm saying people should challenge ideas, not identities. The audience reacted immediately with applause. Joy held up a hand slightly as the sound faded. But Chris, she said, you have to admit that sometimes Hollywood voices dominate the conversation. Chris nodded. That's fair. And that power comes with responsibility. Absolutely. Joy studied him for a moment. Do you think celebrities always handle that responsibility well? Chris smiled again, this time with a hint of humility. Definitely not. The audience laughed. I mean, Chris continued, we're human beings. Joy smirked slightly. Some would say very wealthy human beings. Chris chuckled. Also true. The room relaxed for a second. But then Chris added something that immediately brought the tension back. But wealth doesn't cancel your citizenship. The words landed hard. A few audience members clapped again. Joy leaned forward slowly. Sure, she said. But influence changes things. Chris nodded. It does. Joy pressed further. And when millions of people listen to you, that voice carries weight. Chris's expression turned more serious. That's exactly why I try to think carefully about what I say. Joy crossed her arms again. But do you ever worry that you might be wrong? The question hung there. Chris didn't hesitate this time. All the time. The audience reacted with surprise. Joy's eyebrows lifted. All the time. Chris nodded. Of course. He glanced briefly toward the audience. If you don't question yourself, you stop learning. The room filled with quiet murmurs again. Chris continued. I'm not standing here pretending I have all the answers. Joy leaned in again. But you do speak with confidence. Chris smiled. Confidence doesn't mean certainty. Another ripple of reaction spread through the audience. The discussion had shifted into something almost philosophical now. And yet the tension between them still lingered just beneath the surface. Joy tapped the desk again. But let me ask you something else, she said. Chris nodded. Sure. Joy looked directly at him. When you speak about political issues, do you ever worry you're alienating half your audience? The crowd grew quiet again. Chris thought for a moment before answering. I worry about alienating people who believe I don't have the right to speak. Joy tilted her head. And the people who simply disagree with you? Chris shrugged lightly. Disagreement is healthy. The audience clapped softly again. Joy wasn't done yet. But some people don't see it that way. Chris nodded. That's true. And they stopped supporting actors who talk about politics. Chris smiled faintly. That's their choice. Joy leaned closer. And that doesn't bother you? Chris paused. For the first time in the conversation, his answer felt deeply personal. It used to. The room grew very quiet. Joy watched him carefully. Used to. Chris nodded slowly. When I first started speaking out about things I cared about, I saw the backlash. He glanced briefly toward the audience again. People told me to stay in my lane. Joy smiled slightly. Classic phrase. Chris chuckled. Very classic. Then his expression grew more serious again. But eventually I realized something. Joy leaned forward. What's that? Chris looked straight at her. Silence doesn't make problems disappear. The audience burst into applause. Some even stood briefly before sitting back down. Joy waited for the reaction to settle. Then she asked one final question. A question that felt sharper than any before it. Let me ask you this, Chris. He nodded. If another actor sat where you are right now and said something you strongly disagreed with. Joy paused. Would you defend their right to say it? The room fell silent again. It was the kind of question designed to corner someone. Chris understood that immediately. He sat quietly for a moment. Then he answered. Yes. Joy blinked. Yes. Chris nodded. Absolutely. Joy studied him carefully. Even if you thought they were completely wrong? Chris smiled slightly. Especially then. The audience murmured again. Joy looked intrigued now. Why? Chris leaned forward one more time. Because the moment we decide only the right people get to speak. He paused. We stopped being honest with each other. The room went silent. For the first time since the interview began, Joy didn't immediately respond. Even the other hosts seemed momentarily unsure what to say. The conversation had gone far beyond the usual talk show debate. And yet, there was still one final moment coming. Because what happened next, right before the segment ended, would send the audience into a reaction no one in the studio expected. And within hours, clips from this interview would explode across the internet. The silence after that answer felt different from every other pause that had happened during the interview. Not tense, not awkward, just heavy. For a moment, no one at the table spoke. The audience inside the studio of The View sat completely still, absorbing what had just been said. Across the desk, Joy Behar looked at Chris Evans with an expression that was harder to read now. It wasn't combative anymore. It was thoughtful. Chris leaned back slightly in his chair, the tension that had built over the past several minutes still lingering in the air. One of the other hosts finally broke the silence. Well, I think that might be one of the most honest answers we've heard here in a while. A ripple of laughter and applause moved through the crowd. Joy glanced briefly toward the audience, then back at Chris. You know, she said slowly, I didn't expect Captain America to get philosophical on us today. Chris chuckled quietly. I left the shield at home. The audience laughed again, easing the atmosphere just a little. But everyone in the room could still feel it. Something real had happened during this interview. Something unscripted. Something that didn't follow the usual rhythm of daytime television. Joy rested her hands on the desk again. Well, she said, you certainly didn't stay in your lane. Chris smiled. Never been great with lanes. Another wave of laughter rolled through the studio. But Joy leaned forward again, her voice softer now. I'll give you credit, she admitted. Chris raised an eyebrow slightly. For what? For not dodging the questions. The audience applauded. Chris nodded politely. I came here to talk. Joy smirked faintly. And talk you did. One of the other hosts jumped in with a grin. I think Twitter is going to have a field day with this conversation. The audience laughed knowingly. Chris rubbed the back of his neck. That's always a little terrifying. Joy shook her head with a smile. You knew what you were walking into. Chris shrugged. I hoped for good coffee. The crowd laughed again, the tension slowly dissolving into something lighter. But the producers backstage were already looking at the monitors, because they knew something the audience didn't yet realize. This conversation was already spreading. Clips from the exchange were being uploaded almost instantly. Short segments of Chris calmly challenging questions. Joy pressing harder. The unexpected moments of honesty. Within minutes, the internet began reacting. Later that afternoon, social media feeds filled with headlines. Chris Evans pushes back on The View. Unexpected debate between Chris Evans and Joy Behar. Captain America doesn't hold back on live TV. Clips of the conversation racked up millions of views. Some viewers praised Chris for staying calm and articulate under pressure. Others applauded Joy for asking difficult questions. And of course, some people argued about everything. That's the internet. But inside the studio, none of that chaos had reached them yet. The interview was nearing its end. Joy glanced toward the producers, who were signaling the final minutes. Well, she said, adjusting her glasses, before we wrap this up. Chris looked over. I want to ask one last thing. The audience quieted again. Chris nodded. Go ahead. Joy folded her hands. Do you ever regret speaking your mind so openly? The room went still again. Chris thought about the question carefully. It wasn't hostile. It was almost reflective. He looked out toward the audience for a moment. Then he answered. Sometimes. The honesty surprised people again. Joy nodded slowly. Really? Chris smiled faintly. Sure. He leaned forward slightly. There are days when the noise gets overwhelming. The audience listened closely. But regret isn't the right word. Joy tilted her head. What is the right word? Chris thought for a moment. Responsibility. The word hung in the air. Chris continued quietly. When you realize people are listening to what you say, you start thinking a lot harder about the impact of your words. The room stayed silent. Joy nodded. That's fair. Chris looked back toward her. But I'd still rather speak honestly than stay quiet just to keep everyone comfortable. The audience erupted into applause. Not loud cheering, but genuine applause. The kind that happens when people feel like they've witnessed something real. Joy smiled slightly. Well, she said, you definitely made today interesting. Chris laughed. Glad I could help. The producers signaled again. Joy turned toward the camera. And that's all the time we have today. She paused briefly. But I have a feeling this conversation is far from over. The audience laughed again. Chris stood up as the hosts did. The applause continued as the cameras slowly pulled back. What viewers didn't see was what happened immediately after the segment ended. Several audience members approached Chris as he stepped off the stage. Some thanked him. Others simply said they appreciated hearing a real discussion. Backstage, producers were already talking excitedly. This clip is going everywhere. And they were right. By that evening, the interview had exploded across social media. Debate threads stretched into the thousands of comments. News outlets replayed the moment when Chris calmly responded to Joy's toughest questions. Some viewers said the exchange showed how respectful disagreement should look. Others believed it proved how divided conversations had become. But nearly everyone agreed on one thing. It was unforgettable television. A moment where two strong personalities sat across from each other and didn't avoid the difficult conversation. No shouting, no insults, just tension, questions, and honesty. And that's why millions of people kept watching the clip over and over again. Because in a world of scripted answers and carefully managed interviews, this one felt real. Now we want to hear from you. Do you think Chris Evans handled the questions the right way? Or do you think Joy Behar was right to challenge him on live television? Let us know your thoughts in the comments below. And if you enjoy stories about dramatic celebrity interviews, unexpected confrontations, and the moments that shake up live television, make sure you subscribe to Stage View, like this video, and turn on notifications so you never miss the next explosive story.